morning of October 15th, 1976, was crisp in Massapequa, Long Island. In a modest two-story brick house on Ocean Avenue, a man lay in a simple bed. To the neighbors, he was just another retiree, a quiet, elderly Italian immigrant who spent his afternoons tending to his garden and spoiling his grandchildren. He didn't drive a gold-plated Cadillac. He didn't wear silk suits that shimmered under nightclub lights. He was the kind of man you'd walk past in a grocery store without a second glance. But as the sun rose over the Great South Bay that morning, the FBI's surveillance teams outside were holding their breath. They knew that inside that unremarkable house, the heart of the American Mafia was about to stop beating. Carlo Gambino was the ultimate enigma of the underworld. For decades, the Justice Department had thrown millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours into bringing him down. Yet their evidence lockers remained hauntingly empty. There were no wiretaps of him ordering hits, no ledger books with his signature, and not a single fingerprint on a smoking gun. While other bosses like Albert Anastasia or Vito Genovese craved the spotlight or ruled through naked terror, Gambino operated in the frequencies only dogs could hear. He was a master of shadow leadership, a ghost who haunted the very machine he built. To understand the man, you have to look at the silent witnesses of his life, the humble objects that defined his reign. There was the pair of heavy-duty gardening shears he used to prune his hedges, a hobby that provided the perfect acoustic camouflage against long-range microphones. There were the plain, white envelopes passed in the back of nondescript diners, never containing heroin or black market diamonds, but rather whispered instructions that would move millions of dollars across the Atlantic. By the mid-1960s, Gambino had achieved something his predecessors thought impossible. He had consolidated the 5 families not through a bloody civil war, but through a series of surgical, psychological strikes. He was the cousin Carlo of the commission, a man who would offer you a glass of wine and a warm smile, while his associates were quietly dismantling your entire operation 3 zip codes away. His power didn't come from the barrel of a Tommy gun. It came from his ability to be invisible. Behavioral analysts at the Bureau were obsessed with his profile. He was an introvert in a world of narcissists. While his rivals were getting photographed at the Copacabana, Gambino was sitting in a dim kitchen, drinking espresso and listening. He mastered the art of indirect communication, using layers of buffers, trusted captains who interpreted a nod of his head or a slight frown as a decree of life or death. If you were a federal agent trying to map his network, you weren't looking at a pyramid. You were looking at a spider web where the spider was made of smoke. But even the most disciplined ghosts leave a trail, even if it isn't made of blood. As the 1970s rolled in, the pressure was mounting. The FBI was getting desperate. They were no longer just watching him. They were trying to breathe the same air he breathed, hoping to catch a single slip-up, a single moment of human weakness. They knew that beneath the facade of the kindly grandfather in the garden was a man who had orchestrated some of the most cold-blooded takeovers in criminal history. As the paramedics finally entered the house on Ocean Avenue that October morning, they found a man who had died peacefully of a heart attack, natural causes, the ultimate insult to the lawmen who wanted him behind bars. But as the investigators began to process the scene, they realized that the end of the man was only the beginning of a much darker investigation. Because while Carlo Gambino was gone, he had left behind a blueprint for a criminal empire so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in the American fabric, that it seemed untouchable. The question wasn't just how he died. The question was, who did he kill to make sure he could die in his own bed? To understand how Carlo Gambino outlived his enemies and his pursuers, you have to understand the silence. Throughout the 1960s, while other mob bosses were cleaning for the cameras or painting targets on their own backs with flashy suits and public brawls, Gambino was a shadow in a modest suburban landscape. He lived in a plain brick house in Massapequa, Long Island, a residence that looked more like the home of a retired tailor than the headquarters of the most powerful criminal organization in the Western world. The FBI's invisible net was made of miles of copper wire and thousands of hours of grainy surveillance footage. Between 1960 and 1970, J. Edgar Hoover's G-men turned their full attention toward the man they called the Don of Dons. But Gambino was a master of the dead air. He spoke in whispers, in riddles, and often he didn't speak at all. He mastered the art of the walk and talk, stepping out of his home into the salt-heavy air of the Long Island shore, knowing that the investigators were huddled in a nondescript sedan a block away, their long-range microphones struggling against the ocean breeze. The forensics of the Gambino investigation weren't found in blood spatter or spent shell casings. They were found in the object matrix of nothingness. Investigators analyzed his garbage, his phone records, and his grocery receipts, only to find a man who seemingly didn't exist on paper. There were no ledgers with names and numbers, no signed contracts, no recorded orders to eliminate a rival. The silent witnesses were the empty folders in the FBI's filing cabinets. His strategy was one of shadow leadership, a psychological fortress where he delegated every dirty deed to 5 different layers of middle management. By the time an order reached a hitman's ear, it was no longer a command. It was a suggestion, a shrug, a look. Yet the pressure was suffocating. By the early 1970s, the government was desperate. They tried to deport him back to Italy, citing his illegal entry decades earlier. But Gambino played the ultimate card, his own failing health. Every time a court date came, his heart would flutter, his breath would shorten, and his doctors would provide the documentation that he was too frail to stand trial. It was a brilliant, clinical chess move. He was using the very frailty of his aging body as a shield against the iron fist of the law. Deep within the FBI surveillance logs from 1975, there is a recurring theme: frustration. Agents watched him sit on his porch, a grandfatherly figure in a beige cardigan, sipping espresso. They looked for the monster, but all they saw was a man who seemed to value the stability of the neighborhood more than the violence in the streets. This was his greatest deception. Underneath that calm, strategic exterior, Gambino was pruning his own family tree with the cold precision of a surgeon. He didn't use Baluk Konkai or public violence. He used economic control and psychological manipulation to ensure loyalty. He didn't have to break bones when he could break spirits and bank accounts. But even a ghost leaves a footprint if you know where to look. While the FBI stared at the front door of his home, they missed the subtle shift in the underworld's tectonic plates. Gambino wasn't just staying ahead of the law. He was orchestrating the disappearance of anyone who could link his name to a crime. As the autumn of 1976 approached, the surveillance intensified, and the air around the Gambino estate grew thick with the scent of an impending end. The lawmen knew he was dying, but they didn't know that his final move had already been made. Because in the dark, cold hours of a New York night, a secret arrived at his doorstep, a piece of evidence so volatile that it threatened to burn down everything he had built. And as the agents watched from the shadows, they realized that the old man wasn't just waiting for death. He was waiting for a visitor who wasn't supposed to exist. The Gambino estate grew thick with the scent of an impending end. The lawmen knew he was dying, but they didn't know that his final move had already been made. Because in the dark, cold hours of a New York night, a secret arrived at his doorstep. A piece of evidence so volatile that it threatened to burn down everything he had built. And as the agents watched from the shadows, they realized that the old man wasn't just waiting for death. He was waiting for a visitor who wasn't supposed to exist. That visitor was the living manifestation of a legacy built on the absence of noise. While his contemporaries across the 5 families were loud, gaudy, and prone to public displays of ego, Carlo Gambino had perfected the art of the behavioral ghost. He was a master of the indirect communication network, a strategy where a simple nod over a bowl of pasta at a modest Brooklyn cafe could trigger a chain of events resulting in $1 million heist or a disappearance on the docks. He didn't just lead, he conducted a symphony of crime from the silent center of the storm. By the early 1970s, the FBI's pursuit of Gambino had become an exercise in futility. Their object matrix, the physical evidence needed to secure a conviction, was a vacuum. There were no intercepted phone calls because he never touched a receiver. There were no fingerprints on the ledger sheets because he never held a pen. His power was purely psychological, rooted in a brand of loyalty that felt more like a religious cult than a criminal syndicate. He used shadow leadership to create layers of insulation that even the most determined federal task force couldn't penetrate. But as the calendar turned to October 1976, the Don's greatest enemy wasn't the law, it was his own anatomy. Inside his waterfront home in Massapequa, the biological clock was winding down. The quiet Don was suffering from a deteriorating heart condition, his pulse a faint, irregular rhythm that mirrored the fading era of the Old World Mafia. He spent his final days watching the waves of the Great South Bay, a modest man in a cardigan who looked more like a retired cobbler than the most powerful criminal in American history. The end came on the night of October 15th, 1976. When the final moment arrived, there was no dramatic shootout, no betrayal in a dark alley. The man who had presided over decades of blood and terror passed away quietly in his own bed while watching a television program. The subsequent autopsy findings were a masterclass in irony. The cause of death was officially recorded as a myocardial infarction, natural causes. In a world where the average career ended with a lead-heavy dinner or a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens, Carlo Gambino had achieved the impossible. He died with his boots off and his secrets intact. Yet, as the high-ranking members of the family gathered for a wake that felt more like a coronation, the federal agents watching through long-range lenses noticed something chilling. That mysterious visitor from his final nights was gone, but they left something behind. Rumors began to bleed out of the Gambino inner circle about a final silent witness, a legendary ledger that didn't contain numbers or debts, but the names of every public official, judge, and senator who had ever accepted a Gambino envelope. The FBI searched, but the ledger was never found. It remains the holy grail of organized crime forensics, a ghost story that haunts the halls of justice to this day. Carlo Gambino didn't just take his secrets to the grave. He left them as a weapon, a hidden trigger that ensures his family remains untouchable. Even now, 40 years later, when a New York politician looks over their shoulder or a cold case suddenly goes stagnant, the shadow of the old man falls across the room. Because the most terrifying thing about Carlo Gambino isn't what he did while he was alive. It's the realization that even in death, his silence is still talking.